Got the knock on the window. Good morning and welcome, one and all. Welcome to our online friends this morning. Always trying to improve here at Hope. This time I was able to get the notes today in a digital form, and those should be showing up in the chat space this morning if you would like to follow along. Again, I apologize to our online congregation for not doing that this week. Good morning to those of you here in person. I'm just going to chalk up the attrition rate in this room to the weather this morning, not the conversation or the communicator. That's what I'm going to tell myself. So as you saw last week, I tend to put more content in than I can truly cover, and I believe that I've committed the same foul today as well. I am going to spend a little time in review this morning, highlighting a few things that I skimmed last week, and then I'm going to slow down when I get to the conversation on retributive and restorative justice, and then we'll spend the majority of our time today soaking in, I think there's 5 key texts in the Old Testament and New Testament that deal with mishpat. And then I'll set us up for the next 2 weeks. Next week will be exclusively kind of a video format. I believe my plan at this point is to show 2 videos, one by the Bow Project and the other by For Life of the World, both wrestling with justice in different ways. And then again, I care about learning and engaging in various forms, and so the final Sunday of Advent will be focused on song and how mishpat shows up in the songs of the season. And so there'll be some singing, some reflection. Good morning, Nelsons. Welcome back to the snow of Minnesota. I want to remind us again first of all, the notes are new today. So it is a new set of notes today. There are obviously carryovers from last week as well, but there is new content there. So it's at the music desk or music stand behind Jesse. A big idea today is that, again, this whole series, we're exploring the biblical narrative, allowing it on its own terms to shape our understanding and application of justice. Keith asked an excellent question. Actually, I will get to Keith's question. Alice, you raised a great question, and that is around politics. And I want to emphasize as we enter into this conversation that I would be naive to believe that a justice conversation does not have political tentacles. But I want to remind us again that our overarching goal is to start from the place of the Bible, to understand on its terms, through its own historical and cultural perspective, justice, and then apply it to our contemporary situation. There will be times that obviously we will make these connections in a contemporary setting, but my goal is not necessarily to pit political parties against each other around a narrative of justice. I do want to do a little bit of review. I will pause and take some space to wrestle with some things, but I'd like to get through some of the review quickly and then sit into these formative texts. I think it's important to remind ourselves where is our starting point when talking about justice or any hard conversation when it comes to relationships between human beings, and that is that we begin with the starting spot of the image of God. And it shows up in 3 key places in the biblical narrative. Last week we looked at 2. The first one is in that first page of Genesis, that God created mankind in his own image. In the image of God, he created them, male and female. And then we looked last week at the Noah text, that after the flood and after things are starting to be redone and reignited in terms of God's relationship with humankind, there's this language about re-emphasizing that image of God narrative. And so mankind is not, you're able to eat animals, but when it comes to humans, we protect life. We protect the life of one another. And I emphasized last week and emphasize again this week that any conversation around justice needs to begin with and come back to often the universal value of human life. And conversely, the negative or abuse of another human robs them of their made in the image of God status and constitute injustice, or as the Bible often describes, as wickedness. And I made this comment last week as well, that this is a distinctive of the biblical narrative and of the Christian or Judeo-Christian worldview. So this is not something that is universally held. I made reference last week that even Aristotle, I mean, there are clear, Hall of Fame philosophical voices that have argued for a gradient view of human value. So when it comes to this idea of the image of God, it is a distinctive Judeo-Christian view. We spent a little time last week talking about etymology, that justice, it gets translated from the Hebrew language. The Hebrew word is mishpat. It shows up 419 times in the biblical narrative, which is meant to be an alarm bell for us that this is a dominant word theme within the biblical story. And that it gets translated into English in a variety of ways. Justice is its most popular or common, but it can also be used to describe a right that a human being has. And the reference point I used last week was the Levite family, that they did not have access to land. Their job was to work in the temple. The other 11 tribes had land, would produce food and income, and so it was the right, the mishpat of the Levites to receive a tithe from the other 11 tribes. That was their mishpat. And when the other 11 did not contribute their tithe, that was a lack of mishpat. When they did it, it was mishpat, and when it didn't, that actually then the Bible uses phrases like wickedness. Mishpat is often paired with righteousness, which we will see over the next 3 weeks, mercy, and steadfast love, which is hesed, which is that beautiful Hebrew word. I'm going to pause before I get to the next part. Are there any reflections from last week, or this is just review, or any questions that this ignites for you before I move on to the next section? Last week we talked about 3 predominant orientations towards justice, 3 buckets, if you will, that Michael Sandel, who is a Harvard professor, suggests we all fall into. And we went through these quickly. I'll go through them quickly again. And I'll talk about why I think there's value behind these 3. I think this is where there might be some questions or concerns, so I will pause when we move out of this, or right before we move out of this section. But the first perspective is the maximizing welfare perspective. It's the utilitarian argument that the main idea is simply stated and intuitively appealing, that the highest principle of morality is to maximize happiness, and that the overall balance is pleasure over pain. So this is social equity, this is redistribution of wealth and resources, what will help the most amount of people and reduce the most amount of pain or harm. One of the things that Keith raised last week is around generations. Keith was reflecting on the fact that at Thanksgiving, he has 4 children that were embodying the same space. And what he was noticing is that the way that his kids, adult now, kids in their 20s and 30s, are defining and interacting with the theme of justice versus someone who can be categorized in the boomer category. And I think it's important that this is a space in these 3 buckets where we begin to see where certain generations stereotypically land in some of these buckets. So I would argue, now it's always unfair to offer overarching stereotypes, but the maximizing welfare tends to resonate in 2021, in this current, with a younger audience. If you notice, and Ellis, I'm gonna dance with politics for a second, but if you notice, this is my observation, I'm not a political theorist, but but it seemed like from a novice perspective that when Bernie Sanders was in the running, he had a strong young following, which on the surface seemed a little odd because he had someone who did not look young, and yet his ideology, which was very much in this maximizing welfare narrative, redistribution of wealth narrative, was clearly resonating with a younger demographic. The justice perspective number 2, which is the respecting freedom, this is the libertarian argument, where the central claim is that each of us has a fundamental right to liberty. And so justice is whatever we do, whatever we can do to protect your rights and my rights to do the right thing. And I would argue that this tends to be connected more with my generation and generations that are older than me. That the central value is that we have the rights. We have these rights to choose. And so what we deeply value is my rights and your rights. And I think, Glenn, I think you articulated last week, and I even sat down with you this week to make sure I understood more. This is where it focuses on the outcome, right? And the focus on people having the rights to achieve a prosperous end. But it's up to them to pursue that versus making that accessible to everyone. Okay. Equal opportunity. I knew I was going to screw up outcomes and opportunities. Those words were getting mixed in my head. And then the third perspective that Sandel argues that we fit in, or we tend to fit in, one over the other, is the promoting virtue. This is the moral excellence. This is the idea, is that we're going to do the right thing to the right person, to the right extent, at the right time, with the right motive, and in the right way. So this is what drives justice, is what is the moral thing to do. So when I think about these three, again, the argument is that we tend to inhibit one of these, or inhabit one of these three categories more than the other two, but the argument is that clearly there's overlap between these three views, and that we sit in there, we're all hodgepodges. And that modern American political theory debates the merits of these three perspectives, but I would argue that human frailty and sin interferes with the application of all three justice perspectives. My other argument would be that as Bible devotees, devoted to the Word of God, that we would like the Bible to fit neatly into one of these three categories. But sadly, it does not. So this does require humility, self-reflection, communal reading, and a willingness to allow the biblical narrative to change your view at times when you interact with the biblical witness on justice and peace. I'm going to pause. Does anyone want to interact with these three buckets of justice perspective? Ellis. Ellis made a comment about the redistribution of wealth in a first century context. That was his observation, and I would affirm that. What I would argue at this point, the value of the three buckets is to acknowledge our contemporary lenses that we bring into this conversation, and then I would affirm that what you offered is what we want to pursue in terms of understanding how the Bible talks about these issues, which is historically and culturally bound. So we want to unpack and confirm your observation. That's our journey.
Would you agree that that was primarily the socialistic view as opposed to the other two, or was it a combination of the three?
I want to, without offending you, hold off on answering that question because I would like to actually test that theory. So I don't want to give you what I would perceive as the potential answer until we spend time in Scripture. I don't want to give I don't want to give it away. Renee.
It seems like on that third one that the challenge on doing the right thing, the right person, right extent, right time is who decides? Who decides what's the right thing?
Absolutely.
So who's got the power?
And the argument goes that the utilitarian argument, which is the number one, has the same challenge point, is what is who decides the equation or formula of what is going to produce the greatest happiness over the greatest amount of pain. So there is a question about what criteria do you use to actually arrive at that conclusion. So it's a very great observation. This is why this gets really complicated quickly. It does. But the question which Renee is asking is, who defines reality? Morality. Reality, morality. Yeah. Michael.
I think my comment kind of dovetails into Renee's a little bit because, our definition of morality shouldn't start with our politics. And so Ellis kind of mentioned that too, is that it should start with what is the church supposed to look like? And how does that fit? How does that enact its morality on us? How are we supposed to navigate that outside of these are human views.
Mm-hmm.
This is human morality.
Mm-hmm.
And what happens when Jesus comes into that perspective? It's not really socialist. It's loving your neighbor.
Mm.
And what that looks like may be very offensive
Mm-hmm.
at times.
Mm-hmm.
But that's called following him completely.
Mm-hmm. So if I'm able to summarize your comments, you're wrestling with the lenses, again, that we bring into this and the value of allowing the Bible to shape our perspective rather than contemporary political theory. Okay. Oh, commenting. Okay. But did I capture the essence of where you are? Okay. But did I capture the essence of where you are? Okay. Wow. That's odd. All right, I want to talk about two varieties of justice that will show up in the biblical narrative. There's also a contemporary connectedness to this. The first is the retributive justice. I think this is helpful because it's almost like what is the essential nature of the conversation that we are in when it comes to justice. So the retributive justice is appealing to an existing definition of straightness, which is, again, another word that we use in the English for mishpat, and penalizing when that standard is broken. So Johnny, I don't want to pick just an ambiguous name, I didn't want to name anyone, is traveling 10 miles over the posted speed limit. Johnny is eventually caught, pulled over, and given a ticket that's going to cost him $200, and I don't have any personal contact with that price point amount in tickets, so I pulled that number out of my hat. Yeah. In this scenario, justice is the identification of the infraction and assessing a penalty for violating an established code. So courtroom is typically the place that this form of justice is carried out. So, and here's the deal. This is a form of justice, mishpat, that happens within the biblical narrative. And again, I can't go through we could spend weeks on just all the scripture that wrestling with this, but next week, when I preach on Micah 6:8, that entire Micah chapter 6 is a courtroom. And God is coming in a little bit modified from our contemporary courtroom understanding. He is both the plaintiff and the judge at the same time, but he is bringing a charge to the people. And so it is designed to be seen as this courtroom experience. And so there are similar scenes with Jeremiah and Isaiah. The prophets loved this kind of style of bringing up mishpat, where there's a clear violation of a standard, and they're being called to account for it, and they're being reminded that there is a penalty when you cross over that line and you commit acts of wickedness, a lack of mishpat. Restorative justice is the other understanding or application of justice. So instead of appealing to an existing definition, restorative says it is a creation of new legal codes or an adjustment of current legal code that would foster greater justice for all people. Standards are made or corrected to ensure a society is just and all people are given the chance to thrive. So this is about identifying beyond just an existing code. It's asking the question, is this code actually just? And our shifting of that code so that there's greater justice within that society, that is being then defined as restorative justice. You're taking something that is currently broken and you're giving it a greater form of mishpat, of justice. Do you see how these two are different in their orientation? I also think it's important to acknowledge that when we engage this conversation about justice, which one are we talking about? It's always, I think, important to ask that question. Are we talking about applying, when someone is going through a court trial and they come out acquitted or deemed guilty, what is that phrase? Justice has been served. And we apply that term in that context. But you also hear people say, who maybe feel like the verdict didn't go in the favor that they're hoping for, wait a minute, justice has not been served. We need to look and address at the penal code that was applied in the situation, and it needs to be changed because it does not have mishpat, it does not have justice. We need to change that code so it brings about greater justice within the society. That word is used synonymously, and yet it carries significantly different connotations. Anyone want to wrestle with that or offer any feedback on that narrative? Dick.
So, view number 2, which maximizes freedom, as a way to deal with retributive justice, but not restorative judgment, it seems.
Okay. So Dick is suggesting that the libertarian view, which is deeply and kind of ingrained in the idea of our rights and our protection of rights, his argument is that it would fit more in the retributive justice versus the restorative. Would anyone like to engage that or have any thoughts on that? I think it's a very great question for us to wrestle with.
So whoever's yelling the loudest, generally that enacts the most change at the time. Before we didn't have mass media or mass communication or fast communication, so you couldn't just scream at the top of your lungs and get the change you want.
Yeah.
So I think when I think about that, I think justice, back to Ellis's point about the early church, needs to start at the smaller level. How does justice look in maybe our faith community or our smaller communities? And maybe that's the way the voices should be heard. And that's how maybe we're trying to restore justice too broadly when we can start here.
Okay. So Michael said a couple of things that I think are worth sitting in as well. It goes back to the question of who ultimately gets to determine the categories or where that line is, but also where do we even begin? Do we talk about restorative justice in these small spaces that we may have more influence in versus on larger meta scales? Okay? These are both really good things to sit in. Glenn.
It goes to our court system too. Theoretically, the court system is supposed to be retributive, in other words, interpret laws as they apply to a certain situation. In a lot of cases, they're restorative, where essentially laws are being made from the bench
Mm.
as opposed to interpreting laws that are already there.
Mm-hmm.
This gets a little bit to the political side of things. Originalist interprets the law that's already there, or the Constitution, and the restorative people are kind of making their own laws.
Okay.
And it gets to the point where judges are making laws rather than legislatures. Again, that's a little bit political, but it's
Mm-hmm.
looking at the American system, it's shifting.
Yep. And so Glenn's making a comment about when certain entities are designed to live more in a retributive versus a restorative space, whether it be lawmakers that interpret live stream. Yep. Okay. I think I've been doing that most of the time, but I will try to continue to do better on that. So Glenn's statement is that sometimes we cross over between the retributive and the restorative when maybe we should stay in our lanes, or certain entities within culture should stay in their lanes. What I would just say in support of that, or at least in engagement of that, is this is why it's so important that we actually define what we mean with these terms and how we're applying these terms, because sometimes, again, they're so synonymous that we just flippantly use them, but we don't necessarily really think through how we're actually using them. I want to, Alice, go ahead.
Well, I'm trying to simplify this in my mind. Restorative, doesn't that mean changing the law
Mm-hmm.
so that the retributive system has a different standard of assessing guilt or innocence?
Yes. The question was, isn't the restorative justice perspective, which is about modifying or adding legal code that would reflect greater mishpat justice, would then that cause the retributive side to function more justly? That's essentially what I'm hearing you say. I think that is the design. That is the way that these things are meant to play together. I thought I'm going to move on because I would like to spend the rest of our time in some scripture that I thought Tim Mackey's comment here about the cross was really interesting. So Tim Mackey's the designer behind the Bible Project. He taught in Madison as a teaching pastor. Now he's out west running this ministry. He says, the moment of the cross is precisely the moment where in Jesus, God disadvantages himself while he also accomplishes recompense. The cross becomes the moment that the judge becomes the judged. Or you could say it is where both definitions of justice perfectly meet together at the cross, where God brings a just recompense on human evil, but he provides that by embodying mishpat for the poor by taking it himself. So the cross is where God's love and justice meet together. I personally find that to be profound. That the cross is that place where these two things meet. Does anyone want to comment on that? Is that helpful for anyone else besides me? It's really helpful to me. Exodus chapter 6. Verses 5 to 6. This is a familiar narrative. This is in the narrative of being under the slavery of the Egyptians. So Exodus 6, moreover, I have heard the groaning of the Israelites. This is God speaking, whom the Egyptians are enslaving, and I have remembered my covenant. Therefore, say to the Israelites, I am the Lord, and I will bring you out from under the yoke of the Egyptians. I will free you from being slaves to them, and I will redeem you with an outstretched arm and with mighty acts of mishpat, judgment. So within the Exodus story, God demonstrated justice. What kind of justice is God demonstrating? Which of those two forms, retributive and restorative, is God bringing out? Why would you say retributive? And Barb, why would you say restorative? So, Michael or Renee, you both said retributive. Would you like to articulate why you offered retributive? Okay. Okay. Mm-hmm. Does it complicate things because the law hasn't been written yet? Okay. Okay. Interesting. Okay. Renee, do you want to chime in on that?
Well, it feels like there are consequences. The Egyptians are going to
Yes.
suffer consequences for what they had been doing to the Israelites.
Yes. All right. So Renee's perspective on that was that the retributive side of it is maybe focused on the Egyptians, which will definitely that is a definitive theme that comes both in Exodus, but also shows up very much in the prophets as well, with the Babylonians, the Assyrians. Yes, that is a good pickup. I argued restorative, not because I think I know it, but because there's this sense of redemption and drawing people out of that and putting them in a place of freedom. I do want to argue I think there's more there that we could discuss, but the reason why I started here is because the Exodus story is the origin story for justice for the Hebrew people. That this movement that God brought in terms of rescuing his people is what they refer back to as the understanding of how God works within the people group. I mean, just the number of times that you see this come out, both after the Exodus story directly with Moses, but also in the prophets. I mean, they're constantly referring back to this narrative of what God did with the people in Exodus. Micah 6:8, which is, again, next week's sermon, is so much about that. What Micah's trying to get the people to do to avoid future judgment is to remember what God did in the past. What he did, what his restorative movement was, what his mishpat was in the past, appealing to that so that they might live better into the design that God has for them in the contemporary. So my point in starting with the Exodus is that's the origin story. If you think about it, I'll maybe get in trouble for this. It is the Big Bang of justice. It's where it starts, and then it's about seeing how it continues to. If we want to take that out of the recording, that'd be great.
Okay, so doesn't that mean that it was a time when the people went from having no rights to having rights? They had no rights under the Egyptians, but then they were released from that into a situation where now they did have rights to self-pursuit and happiness.
So Alice's question is, would we say then that there were no rights prior to their freedom, and that the movement out of the Exodus narrative is about giving them rights? That's his question. Does anyone want to respond to that? I agree.
The Egyptians had rights of ownership of the slaves. Their rights were taken away to give rights
Israelites.
So it's a balance, moving back and forth, it seems.
So Glenn's contribution to this, which I think is very good, is that the Egyptians had rights, so to speak. They weren't just rights, but they were rights of ownership of the Israelites as slaves. And there's a transfer of rights from the Egyptians to the Israelites as they leave the Exodus experience. Okay. Yeah, so Donna's reflection is that maybe there were some rights that they had while they were enslaved, to the point that when they left, they didn't like the full sense of freedom that they experienced, that they'd rather go back to the arrangement that they had. They didn't like their day job. Yeah, I think there's a lot of things here worthy of us to continue to sit in. But realizing the time, I'm going to move us on. Psalm 146, 6-9. He is the maker of heaven and earth, the sea and everything in them. He remains faithful forever. He upholds the cause. Okay, this is a new way that mishpat is defined or translated into English. He upholds the mishpat of the oppressed. He gives food to the hungry. The Lord sets prisoners free. The Lord gives sight to the blind. The Lord lifts up those who are bowed down. The Lord loves the righteous. The Lord watches over the foreigner, sustains the fatherless and the widow, but he frustrates the ways of the wicked. Who's the initiator of mishpat in Psalm 146? The Lord. The Lord. Gary's pointing north. The Lord. What we want to identify is that God's investment or propensity towards this kind of behavior is ultimately a reflection of his character. There is a deep link between the heart of God, the character of God, then also with the nature and design of our relationship with him and our relationship to one another. Like, these are all so interlinked. Let's look at the idea of the oppressed. Just simply look at that passage, that second sentence. He upholds the cause, the mishpat, the justice of the oppressed, and gives food to the hungry. How would you describe the function of justice according to this verse as it relates to the cause of the oppressed? How do you describe the function? How does justice function in this verse as it relates to the oppressed? How do, So let me make sure I repeat that again. The function is to serve the underserved. That's what you said, okay? You want to unpack that? Hmm.
You know, like, what do we believe? You know, do we believe that God is the judge? You know, we use the judgment language, and now it seems like it's just flowed over into the social stream of, you know, where we're living.
Hmm. Could I ask if you are saying that, and this is where generations matter, that you use the word term 30 years ago. I don't know if that's, I'm just going to continue to repeat that. 30 years ago, the narrative on justice was more focused on the vertical dimension of God as judge and my relationship with the judge. And now that vertical has become much more focused on the horizontal in terms of the relationship between humans, specifically around the narrative of those that are underprivileged or disadvantaged.
That's my experience as a person that, you know, listens to a sermon every Sunday since I became a Christian. It seems to have
Shifted.
evolved past what does this mean for personal salvation, or what does our perspective on justice mean for the life of the world, you know,
Okay.
to use our phrase.
Okay.
I see that word as uphold the cause of the oppressed is a respect for the people that are oppressed.
Hmm.
More of a respect for them, and along with what Donna says, to serve them in the next phrase that,
Mm-hmm.
that he sets the prisoners free.
Mm-hmm.
Feeds the hungry.
So Barb uses the word respect, that when you see mishpat of the oppressed, it is a sense of giving dignity to those that are in that place of disadvantage or oppression. Gary Noble.
So I look at this more, going back to your question of like, what's the theme of this?
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
The theme is that the Lord does these things with nothing in return, not expecting anything in return. That's one way justice is doled out. Another thing is I think everybody's probably seen himself in this verse at some point in their life. I mean, I think my kids when they're hungry. I think I've been bowed down at times in my life. So this is more to me about if you're familiar with the term reciprocal altruism. I'll give you a quick example. In elephant kingdom, every elephant takes care of other elephants just because they would want some other elephant to feed their baby elephant or whatever, with no return expected.
Mm-hmm.
And I think that's how justice should work, right? I'm gonna look out for other people and expect nothing in return. And God's doing the same thing in this verse. I'm going to do these things, and I know I'm getting nothing back. I don't expect anything back. This is a one-way relationship in some ways.
Okay. Gary is articulating that what he notices, which I think is astute in this passage, is that the acts do not necessarily have a reciprocation to it. They're not, justice in this context does not necessarily have strings attached. Is that fair? What's interesting is that these are being modeled as ideal. So, in some sense, I'm just interacting with you in live time, where I do think that these are oftentimes characterized in such a way that the follower, the disciple, the person who is, there's a calling to embody this as well. But it is different than what you're saying. It's not an act done so it gets something in return. But this is, I think, being framed in such a way that says, well, if you're going to be in connection to this being, then our behavior on some level has to model this. And that's where I think there is a string, quote unquote, that's attached, if that's fair. Mike wants to say something. Okay.
I think when I read this, I start thinking about what you mentioned about not mishpat
Mm.
at the end. And so what is that? You know, I think as Christians, we get blinded by that. We don't understand. You know, we think all these good things that we're doing and all these good thoughts we have. What is not mishpat that we're enabling? And
Mm.
that's what I think it. So the function of mishpat in this is, for me, is a barometer.
Mm.
Or some kind of measure of who I am as a man
Mm.
who follows God.
Mm. Yeah. So that idea of a barometer is an ability to reflect on where we've lived into these values. Yeah. Mm. Mm. Yeah. Almost to the point of reflecting what are the opposites of these. So if it is to take up the cause of the oppressed, what is the reciprocal of that? Is it to ignore the plight of the oppressed? Mm. Yeah. 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 This is a very, hopefully to you as well, it's been to me a life-giving conversation. I am going to end it now, recognizing that I've missed the punchline. There's a verse or a section in Isaiah 58 that's in here, that then Jesus directly quotes. I think that's where we're going to start next week, because we want to see the linkage between the Old Testament narrative around justice and how Jesus directly puts himself in relationship to that. So I do want to I want to get to Jesus. We got to get to Jesus, and then we will move to a couple other conversations. So thank you for this conversation. Thank you online for being a part of this conversation. And we will start worship in 13 minutes.